My name is Gerald Monroe. I turned 79 last October, and for the past 6 years, my world has been shrinking at an uncomfortable pace. I used to teach woodworking at the local vocational school in Muncie, Indiana, a job I held for nearly 4 decades. But these days, the smell of cedar and varnish has been replaced by the antiseptic sterility of pill bottles and the hum of the old refrigerator in my kitchen. My days begin with pain and end with silence. I wake up slowly, not because I'm lazy or indulgent, but because it takes time for my bones to cooperate. I sit on the edge of the bed, my feet on the cold wooden floor, and I breathe in the stillness of a house that once echoed with laughter and conversations and the steady scratch of my wife's pen as she worked on her crossword puzzles. Ellie, my late wife, passed away nearly a decade ago after a long, harrowing battle with ovarian cancer. Her absence is not just felt. It's sculpted into the very walls of this house, etched into the chipped china she loved, still stacked neatly in the cupboard, though no one's touched it in years. When Ellie died, I didn't cry at the funeral, not because I wasn't heartbroken, God knows I was, but because I didn't know how. Grief changed shape over the years, from something sharp and searing to something heavy and constant, like carrying a bag of wet sand everywhere you go. After she was gone, I had one companion left in this house, and that was Barney, a wheezing old golden retriever Ellie had brought home as a surprise on our 45th anniversary. "So you won't be alone when I go first," she'd said with that crooked grin of hers. It was a joke at the time, one of her darkly comic jabs at mortality, but in the end, it was the most foresighted thing she ever did. Barney outlived her. He stayed with me through the long winters, curling beside my legs on the recliner, snoring like a miniature engine. He never minded my rants at the television, my tendency to repeat myself, or the silence that sometimes stretched for days when no one else called. He was the only living thing in this house that remembered the same past I did. My son Mitchell visits once every few months. Sometimes with his wife Tammy, more often without. They live just an hour away in Noblesville, but you'd think it was across the country the way he talks about traffic and commitments and how busy life gets. Mitchell's a financial consultant, very polished, very sharp, very much his mother's. Ambition and my temperament, a dangerous combination. We used to be close, or maybe I just thought we were when he was a boy, before time and money turned him into someone who treated affection like a ledger entry. Every time he visits, it's the same routine. A few tight smiles, some polite questions about my health, and then his gaze flicks around the house like he's assessing the market value of every object he sees. He calls it concern. I call it preparation. Tammy, his wife, has never liked me. That's no secret. She thinks I'm gruff and old-fashioned, which is true, but I'm not cruel. She once told Mitchell within my earshot that I romanticize the past to cover for how little I actually did as a father. That cut deeper than I let on. I may not have been perfect, but I built this house with my own hands, paid every bill, stayed faithful to my wife until the day she died, and never raised a hand to my son. Not once. I gave him everything I knew how to give. But to Tammy, that was never enough. She thinks money is love, and since I never showered Mitchell with cash, I must have failed him emotionally. The last time they visited, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. She said, "If something happens to him, we'll have to deal with the house and that damn dog. You know he's not putting things in order." Mitchell just muttered something about looking into power of attorney. They stopped talking when they saw me. I didn't ask them to continue. It's strange how a man can feel himself becoming obsolete in his own life. The world no longer needs my skills, my stories, or my advice. Even the tools in my shed are rusting from lack of use. I used to repair things for the whole neighborhood. Screen doors, broken chairs, shelves. Now the neighbors are younger, the kind who prefer Amazon over asking a retired old man to fix a hinge. My hands, once so steady, now tremble when I butter toast. I try not to think about how many people I used to matter to, and how few even remember I exist. But Barney always remembers. Every morning, he shuffles to the foot of my bed and whines until I sit up. He waits patiently while I get dressed, trailing after me like a shadow, his joints just as creaky as mine. He knows when I'm having a bad day. On those days, he rests his chin on my knee and looks up at me with those tired brown eyes, as if to say, "I know, old man. I know." And I believe he does. We've mourned together, aged together, and carried the weight of Ellie's absence together. I sometimes wonder what will happen when he goes. I know that day is coming. He's 15 now, mostly deaf, half blind, and slow. His back legs give out sometimes, and I have to lift him into the car when we go to the vet. But he still wags his tail. He still greets me like I'm the center of the universe. No one else does that. And so, despite the mounting bills, the doctor's warnings about lifting weight, and my son's subtle suggestions that I should consider rehoming him, I hold on to Barney like a man gripping a lifeline. Because he is one, I don't have much left. No travel plans, no hobbies worth mentioning, no social clubs or bridge nights. Just Barney, the cold mornings, the creaky floors, and the long shadows of memory. And when I pray, which I still do every now and then, I don't ask for health or forgiveness. I ask for one simple thing: to die before the dog. Because if Barney goes first, I don't know how much longer I'll last without him. But as it turned out, I didn't get that wish. Something else happened, something that changed everything. And not just for me. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when the pain in my chest first became impossible to ignore. I'd felt a dull ache before, a kind of tightness that crept in when I was walking Barney around the block or shoveling light snow from the walkway. But that morning, it was different. It came like a fist, full and sudden, pressing into the center of my ribs and radiating upward into my jaw, my arms, my back. I remember gasping, not out of fear but surprise, as if my own body had decided to betray me without warning. I sat down heavily on the floor in the hallway, one hand on the wall for balance, the other pressed to my chest, and I remember Barney barking, circling me, then resting his head against my arm as if trying to anchor me in place. I didn't black out, but I must have lost time, because when I finally gathered enough sense to reach for the cordless phone on the side table, the sunlight had shifted noticeably across the living room carpet. I called 911, and my voice must have carried some note of urgency I didn't intend, because they were at my door in under 15 minutes. The paramedics were young, polite, efficient, and far too calm. One of them called me "Sir" with such mechanical cheer that it made me want to laugh, even as he strapped wires to my chest and took my blood pressure. They told me I was lucky. Not a full heart attack, they said, but close. Severe angina, dangerously high blood pressure, and signs of arrhythmia. I needed observation. I needed tests. I needed to come with them. And so I did, carried out on a stretcher past Barney, who barked sharply, panicked, his paws scraping uselessly at the hardwood floor as if trying to follow me out the door. I called back to him, tried to reassure him, but the door shut before I could finish my sentence. The hospital stay was longer than expected. What was supposed to be a one-night observation turned into a 5-day ordeal of tests, scans, monitoring, and a small surgical procedure to place a stent. The staff were professional, overworked, and forgettable. The food was terrible. I hated the smell of the place. Bleach and sickness and loneliness. And I hated the way no one really looked at me when they talked, like I was just another bed to check off on their charts. I had one visitor, Mitchell. He came on the third day, brought coffee I couldn't drink, and flowers that made me sneeze. He stayed for exactly 27 minutes. I know this because I stared at the clock the whole time. He sat on the plastic chair beside my bed, scrolling through his phone between stilted questions about how I felt and what the doctors had said. I asked him how Barney was. He hesitated, said Tammy had taken him to a specialty place because he was having trouble adjusting and seemed distressed. I asked what kind of place. He shrugged. A holding facility, he said vaguely. Not a shelter exactly, but a place where older dogs can be evaluated for rehoming or hospice care. The words landed like ice water. Rehoming? Hospice care? Barney wasn't dying. He was old, yes, but not dying. I asked why they hadn't just kept him at their house. Mitchell muttered something about allergies, that Tammy's sister was staying with them, and she was extremely sensitive. And besides, their HOA didn't allow dogs over 40 pounds. I stared at him, stunned, but he avoided my eyes. He said they'd done the best thing for everyone involved. I didn't respond. I was afraid if I did, I'd say something I couldn't take back. When I was finally discharged on the 5th day, I stepped out of the hospital with a paper bag full of prescriptions and a heart heavier than when I'd arrived. I'd told Mitchell not to pick me up. I needed a cab, I said. I needed a moment to myself before I faced the silence of my home. The ride was quiet. The cab driver didn't speak, and I was grateful. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed that the porch light was still on, burning pointlessly in the morning sun. I paid the fare, walked slowly up the steps, and opened the front door. The house smelled different, cleaner somehow, but unfamiliar. Too much lemon, too much artificial lavender. Someone had come through and scrubbed everything, but in doing so, they'd erased the comfort of my lived-in mess. I stood in the living room for a long time, just breathing. No paw sounds, no jingling collar, no Barney. I called his name once, stupidly, and heard the echo of my voice bounce off the walls. I called Mitchell, straight to voicemail. I tried Tammy. She answered on the second ring, sounding surprised, like she hadn't expected to hear from me so soon. I asked about Barney. She sighed, said that unfortunately there had been some complications, that the facility had deemed him unsuitable for rehoming due to his age and condition, and that they had made the decision to euthanize him. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed, like someone reading off a script they didn't quite believe. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just listened. When she finished, I thanked her for letting me know and hung up. Then I sat down in my recliner, the one with the worn armrest Barney used to rest his head on, and I stared at the blank TV screen for what felt like hours. It wasn't just that Barney was gone. It was that they had decided without me, without even calling, without asking what I wanted or what I needed or how I felt. They had taken the one living connection I had left in this world and disposed of it like it was a broken appliance, a nuisance to be cleared out. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was underwater, drowning in a current of betrayal. I opened the cabinet where I kept Barney's leash, his bowl, his old squeaky toy shaped like a duck. Everything was gone, even the photos on the fridge. The one of him and Ellie in the backyard. The one of him dressed in a ridiculous Santa hat one Christmas. All gone. As if he had never existed. As if they had erased him not just from the house, but from my life, from my memory. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room with a blanket over my knees, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the settling house. I thought about Ellie. What she would say. What she would do. She would be furious, I knew that. She loved Barney as much as I did. I imagined her voice, scolding Mitchell, calling Tammy a snake, telling me to stand up for myself. And that was the moment it shifted. The grief calcified into something else. Resolve. I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. They had taken too much from me already. My dignity, my autonomy, my home. And now they had taken Barney. But they had made a mistake. A small one. Maybe they thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe they thought I was too old or too slow. But I noticed. In their rush to cleanse the house of every trace of him, they missed one thing. A tag. Barney's old collar tag, the one with his name and my address on the back, had slipped under the bookshelf by the door. I found it that night while searching for his spare leash. It was tarnished, but the engraving was still clear. And suddenly, I knew. Barney wasn't gone, at least not the way they said. Something wasn't right. And I was going to find out what. I began my search with the stubborn determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. It started with a call to the number on the back of Barney's tag. The local vet clinic where we had always taken him since Ellie brought him home. I asked if they had any record of him being euthanized recently. The woman on the phone, whose voice trembled with a mix of politeness and mild discomfort, asked for Barney's full name and my contact information. There was a pause. Then she returned and said that there had been no recent euthanasia records under his name. In fact, the last time they saw Barney was for a checkup nearly a year ago, and they had marked him as elderly but stable. When I asked if any facility might have taken him in after I was hospitalized, she said that while they occasionally coordinated with local shelters or senior dog sanctuaries, they always required the owner's consent. Her tone changed slightly, taking on the kind of professional edge that suggested something wasn't sitting right with her either. She suggested I call the county shelter. I did, and the pattern repeated. They had no dog matching Barney's description in their records for intake, transfer, or euthanasia in the past month. They even cross-checked neighboring counties and rescues. Nothing. Barney hadn't gone through any official channels. That, in itself, was the first true confirmation that something was terribly wrong. The more I pulled at the thread, the more things unraveled. I called Mitchell again, this time leaving a long voicemail, calm but direct, asking him to clarify exactly what had happened, where he had taken Barney, and when. No response. I waited a day. I tried again. Finally, I called his office, pretending to be a client. His secretary informed me he was on a brief personal hiatus and that any inquiries could be directed to his partner. That sent a chill through me. Mitchell never took time off unless it was for some premeditated purpose. I began to suspect that this entire sequence, from my hospital admission to Barney's disappearance, was not just a case of inconvenience or incompetence, but something far more intentional. The pieces fell together too neatly: the thorough cleaning of my house, the removal of every physical trace of my dog, the refusal to take my calls, and the vague responses when they did speak to me. These weren't coincidences. They were cover-ups. Then came the discovery that confirmed my deepest fears. I was sorting through a drawer in my bedroom that I hadn't touched in months, looking for an old folder with Barney's adoption papers. Instead, I found something I didn't expect. A manila envelope addressed to me, unopened, postmarked 4 days prior to my hospitalization. Inside was a letter from a local real estate agency. It thanked me for our recent conversation and enclosed a preliminary assessment of my home's market value, along with a sample listing agreement. My name was typed in the header, but I hadn't contacted any realtor. My heart pounded. I flipped through the pages, and there it was. Mitchell's name and signature at the bottom of the inquiry request form, dated 2 days before I collapsed in the hallway. He had contacted a realtor behind my back. He was planning to sell the house. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property in the fading light, my steps slow and deliberate. I stopped at every corner, every patch of garden Ellie once planted, every window that had once framed her silhouette. I tried to imagine it gone, empty, someone else's. I tried to imagine my name removed from the deed, erased like a chalk mark. I thought of all the birthdays, anniversaries, and winters in this house. Of Barney lying under the table during dinner. Of Ellie humming while she folded laundry. Of me carving wooden toys for the children we never had. This wasn't just a house. It was the last structure in my life that still held any meaning. And Mitchell, my own son, was planning to sell it. I called my neighbor, Ruth. She was in her 70s too, sharp-minded and discreet, and she had lived 2 houses down since before Mitchell was born. I asked her if she'd seen anything unusual during the week I'd been in the hospital. She hesitated at first, but eventually admitted she had seen Mitchell and Tammy coming and going multiple times. Once with a man she didn't recognize who was carrying what looked like a large camera bag. Like a photographer or maybe a surveyor, she said. They had been inside for several hours one afternoon, and afterward, Mitchell was carrying boxes out to the car. Not furniture, she said, paperwork, binders. She remembered the labels. Documents, estate, and one labeled Dad Medical. My chest tightened. They were organizing, preparing, and they didn't think I'd notice. I went to the courthouse the next morning to request a copy of my property title. I wanted to confirm that nothing had changed. To my relief, the house was still in my name alone. But that was not reassurance. It was a warning. If Mitchell hadn't already transferred the deed, it meant he was likely preparing to obtain power of attorney or some other form of control. I remembered how years ago, when Ellie was diagnosed, we'd visited a lawyer to draft our wills. Mitchell had come with us. He knew all the procedures. He knew what papers looked like, what signatures were needed, what tricks could be played when someone was too tired or confused to read the fine print. I realized I hadn't updated anything since Ellie died. The will, the healthcare proxy, the financial directives, they were all vulnerable. And now Mitchell was circling like a shark. The next logical step was to check my accounts. I visited my local branch bank and asked the manager, a kind woman named Eleanor, who had known me for years, if any changes had been made to my records. She looked puzzled and went into the back room to retrieve the files. When she returned, she informed me that there had been a recent inquiry into my joint account, the one Mitchell had access to since he was a teenager, long forgotten and rarely used. According to the logs, there had been a request to update the account holder's status due to a health event. I demanded to see the form. Sure enough, there was a scanned version of a document, unsigned but submitted online, listing me as currently incapacitated. The box for temporary conservatorship requested had been checked. No wonder they had taken Barney. No wonder they cleaned the house. They weren't just trying to help. They were staging a coup. I left the bank trembling, not from fear, but rage. I had devoted my life to building something for my family. And now they were carving it up before I was even gone. I thought of Tammy's sharp voice on the phone, the way she had so coldly informed me of Barney's death. I thought of Mitchell's tight-lipped discomfort in the hospital room, his refusal to meet my gaze. I thought of the silence that had followed every one of my calls since then. And I knew then that it wasn't just about the dog. It wasn't just about the house. It was about control, power, inheritance. They saw me as an obstacle to be managed, a declining figure to be quietly ushered into irrelevance, while they rearranged the furniture and counted the dollars. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the desk drawer where I kept all my legal files, blew the dust off Ellie's folder, and began reading. I stayed up until sunrise, combing through every document, every clause, every outdated signature. I wrote notes, I circled names. I listed dates. And somewhere in the quiet stretch between midnight and dawn, a thought occurred to me. Simple but blinding in its clarity. If they wanted me gone, erased, then they must believe I couldn't fight back. That was their first mistake. Because I could. And I would. Starting with Barney. If he was still alive, and in my heart I believed he was, I would find him. And if he wasn't, I would find the proof of their lie and make sure they were never trusted again. I was not going to be silenced. Not by my son. Not by his wife. Not by anyone. The breakthrough came in the form of a mistake, a sloppy, almost careless oversight that revealed more than a dozen conversations could have. On a rainy Thursday morning, I was going through the recycling bin outside my house, searching for a document I might have accidentally tossed in during one of my sleepless cleaning fits. It was there, soaked but still legible, half buried under a pizza flyer and a week-old newspaper. A crumpled veterinary receipt with Tammy's name printed at the top, dated just 2 days after I was admitted to the hospital. The receipt listed a canine wellness check for a senior dog named Barney M. The vet's name wasn't one I recognized. It was a private clinic across town, one I'd never been to, and definitely not where we'd taken Barney in the past. What stood out most wasn't the checkup. It was the last item on the bill. Behavioral evaluation. Transfer candidate. My heart pounded as I held the paper in my hands, the rain soaking through the thin fabric of my jacket, making the ink smudge slightly. This wasn't a euthanasia notice. This was something else entirely. I immediately called the clinic. I didn't pretend. I told the truth. My name, my relationship to the dog, my suspicions. The receptionist hesitated, but eventually transferred me to a vet technician who'd apparently been there during Barney's visit. She was cautious, professional, but something in her tone softened when I explained that I believed my son and daughter-in-law had taken Barney without my consent. She admitted, in a hushed voice, that Barney had indeed been brought in by a couple claiming to be his legal caretakers. The woman was insistent, she said. She filled out paperwork saying you'd had a stroke, that you were no longer capable of providing care, and that the dog had no one else. I asked what had happened next. The tech paused, then said, "Normally we'd take that at face value. But something didn't feel right. The dog was attached. Kept looking at the door like he was waiting for someone. Whined constantly. The husband seemed cold. The woman, well, she cried. But it didn't seem genuine. We didn't euthanize him. He was transferred to a sanctuary partner for evaluation." My throat tightened. "Is he still there?" I asked. "Can you tell me where?" She hesitated again. "That's not something I'm supposed to—" I cut in, desperate. "Please, that dog is my life. He's all I have. I don't care if I have to walk 10 miles or sign 100 forms. Just tell me where to start." There was silence. Then she whispered an address. They don't usually allow drop-ins. But if you explain, maybe they'll let you see him. It took me an hour to get there by cab. The sanctuary was nestled in the outskirts, surrounded by open fields and heavy fences. A cheerful sign out front read Whisper Oak, Senior Canine Care and Placement. I felt absurdly hopeful for the first time in weeks, as if the air itself had shifted. At the front office, I was greeted by a middle-aged woman named Marie, who looked me over with suspicion. I told her everything. My hospitalization, my son, the forged consent, the disappearance of my dog. Her expression darkened. She stepped into a back room for a long time and returned with a clipboard. "We have a retriever named Barney, yes," she said. "He came to us under questionable pretenses." We'd been waiting on some documentation before making any permanent decisions. My breath caught. "Can I see him?" I asked. Marie eyed me for a long time, then nodded. She led me down a long corridor lined with clean kennels. The space smelled like disinfectant and peanut butter. My heart thudded with each step, and then, around the corner, I saw him. Barney. Lying on a padded mat, his head resting on his paws, his fur thinner than I remembered but unmistakable. As soon as he saw me, he stood up, staggered slightly, and then let out a low, guttural bark, followed by a whimpering cry that broke something open inside me. I dropped to my knees. He barreled toward the gate, tail wagging so hard his whole body wobbled. I pressed my hand to the metal, and he pressed his muzzle to the same spot, whining, eyes bright with recognition. I could barely speak. Marie stood back, watching silently. After a minute, she unlocked the gate. Barney came straight into my arms, licking my face, nosing at my pockets, the way he always did when he knew I had treats. I held him, and for the first time in what felt like years, I cried. Not from grief, not from rage, from relief. We sat together in that room for a long time. Marie brought paperwork. I signed every form they had. Proof of ownership, vet records, ID. They asked for a modest donation for care and boarding. I gave them triple. As we were finishing, Marie said almost offhandedly, "You know, we've seen a few cases like this lately. Family members trying to rehome pets when someone ends up in the hospital. Sometimes for money, sometimes just out of convenience. It's always ugly. But this was personal." I nodded, unable to speak. Barney sat beside me, his head resting on my shoe. Marie added, "They didn't expect you to fight, but you did. That dog knew you'd come." I took Barney home that evening. He was slower, yes, more fragile, but he was still mine. We both limped up the porch steps, side by side like old soldiers returning from a war they didn't expect to survive. Once inside, I laid out his blanket, poured him fresh water, and sat beside him until he fell asleep, snoring gently. The house felt different now, not full, but no longer empty. But my relief was short-lived, because now I knew the extent of their deception. Now I had proof. They had lied, forged, manipulated. And it wasn't just about Barney anymore. They'd tried to take everything. My home, my freedom, my dignity, and they would try again, unless I stopped them, which meant the next step wasn't forgiveness, it was justice, and I was ready. When I brought Barney back into the house, something inside me had shifted, an internal tremor that wasn't going to stop until the ground beneath Mitchell and Tammy's schemes crumbled. The moment the door closed behind us and Barney lay down with a sigh on his old blanket by the fireplace, I knew with a clarity sharper than grief that this was only the beginning. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had counted on my silence, on my weakness, on age turning me into a passive shadow of a man they could maneuver at will. But they had miscalculated something crucial. They had taken the one thing that tethered me to peace, to memory, to my wife's voice in my head telling me to keep going. They had tried to make me disappear. Now it was my turn to make sure I would be seen. I began by visiting the attorney who had helped Ellie and me draft our will decades ago. His name was Charles Milton, a serious man in his 70s with hands that trembled slightly as he paged through old files, but whose mind was razor sharp. When I explained everything, my hospitalization, the unauthorized decisions about Barney, the attempted real estate contacts, and most damning of all, the forged documents suggesting I was mentally incapacitated, Charles's face hardened. "They're building a case," he said bluntly. "They want to establish a pattern of incompetence, of vulnerability, It's a slow erosion of your credibility. If you hadn't intervened, you would have come home to find the house sold, your bank account restructured, and perhaps even a legal motion filed to put you under guardianship. Conservatorship, most likely. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, then looked at me squarely. But you're not late. You're just in time. With Charles's help, I filed a cease and desist order with the local real estate board, prohibiting any listing or inquiry involving my property without direct and notarized consent. I had my medical records compiled and notarized, clear evidence that I had suffered no stroke, no neurological event, no loss of faculties. I visited my physician, who gladly provided an affidavit stating my full cognitive capacity, mental clarity, and autonomy. Then I moved on to the financial front. I requested transaction histories for all shared accounts that Mitchell had access to. The findings made my stomach turn. In the 2 weeks surrounding my hospital stay, he had initiated several online access requests, transferred funds from the joint account under medical necessity clauses, and attempted, unsuccessfully, thank God, to add his name as an account manager. On one of my primary savings accounts, I printed every page, every timestamp, every digital fingerprint. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I wanted everything lined up, airtight, final. So I kept digging. Through Charles's office, I requested the title deed of my house, reviewed the mortgage status, and confirmed that my name was still the sole title holder. That was good, but temporary. If I died, the will would pass everything to Mitchell, as Ellie and I had written it in better years, when the idea of betrayal from our only child seemed impossible. That had to change. I rewrote the will with new beneficiaries, charitable organizations, a veterans fund, and a local dog rescue network. I left Mitchell $1, legally sufficient to avoid contestation, but crystal clear in meaning. And I added a provision. If any attempt to declare me incapacitated was made under false pretense, all parties involved would be explicitly disinherited. It was a grim process, but necessary. The more steps I took, the more the truth unspooled. I called the vet tech from Whisper Oak again, asking if she had any documentation from the day Barney was surrendered. She emailed me a scanned intake form, and there, in Tammy's neat cursive, was the phrase that made my hands shake. Owner permanently incapacitated, unable to manage household or pet care. There it was, in black and white. The lie. A lie she had confidently committed to paper, assuming I'd never see it. I printed it, highlighted it, added it to the file now growing thick with exhibits. It wasn't just the past I was protecting anymore. It was the future, because if they had done this once, they'd try again. Mitchell had shown his hand. This wasn't about worry or compassion. It was about positioning himself to take everything while I was still breathing. I began to notice other details I had missed, subtle but damning. My mailbox had been tampered with. I started receiving redirected bills all addressed care of Mitchell Hollis. I visited the post office. The clerk confirmed that someone had submitted a temporary forwarding request. Forged. I demanded the form. I had to wait a week, but when it arrived, I saw it was signed with my name in an imitation so poor it was almost laughable. Mitchell wasn't even trying to hide it well, because he didn't think he needed to. When I finally decided to act, I didn't go quietly. I made appointments at the police department, the county clerk's office, and the local Elder Abuse Commission. I handed them all copies of the same folder: receipts, medical letters, the intake form from the dog sanctuary, the forged postal form, financial transactions, the vet affidavit, and even Ruth's statement about seeing Mitchell with a real estate agent. During my hospitalization, no one dismissed me. They listened, they took notes, they opened case numbers, they promised follow-up, and then I called Mitchell. He picked up on the third ring, sounding rushed, like I was just another obligation on a list he'd been meaning to check off. I told him we needed to meet. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said evenly. "I'd like to clear it up in person." He hesitated, then agreed to come by the house the next evening. When he arrived, Tammy was with him. Of course she was. She walked in like she owned the place, her eyes darting across the room as if measuring what still might be salvaged. Barney growled at her from his spot by the fireplace. She flinched. "Nice to see you too," she muttered under her breath. Mitchell looked older than I remembered. More lines in his face, more gray at the temples, but none of that softened what I saw in his eyes. Calculation. Worry. The look of a man who knows the ground beneath him is beginning to shift. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't ask how they were. I sat down in my chair, the legal folder in my lap, and began to speak. I told them everything. The vet, the clinic, the sanctuary, the forged consent form, the redirected mail, the bank account inquiries, the real estate contact. I laid it all out like a prosecutor before the court. They didn't interrupt at first. Mitchell's face paled, and Tammy's hands clenched and unclenched in her lap. "When I mentioned the intake form from Whisper Oak," she snapped. "We were trying to help," she hissed. "You're an old man living alone with a crippled dog and no supervision. You could have died on that floor, and no one would have known for days." "That's not your decision," I said, my voice level but cold. "That's not your right. And I'm not incapable. I'm not forgetful. I'm not helpless. I survived a health scare and came home to find my life had been looted while I was lying in a hospital bed." Mitchell stood up. "You don't understand how complicated this has been. We were trying to plan for the future, for your sake, for everyone's sake." "You mean you were trying to ensure you didn't have to wait?" I said. "Trying to put everything in place so that when I did die, or if I didn't, you could just move in and take over. And you didn't care who got hurt in the process. Not me. Not even the dog." Tammy scoffed. "You're being dramatic. No one died. You're still here. The dog's still alive. What do you want from us? An apology?" I opened the folder and pulled out a copy of the legal notice. "I want you to stay away from me. I filed complaints with the police and with Elder Protective Services. There are ongoing investigations. If I find any more attempts to access my financial information or interfere with my property, I will pursue criminal charges. You are no longer part of my legal affairs. You are no longer welcome in this house." They didn't speak as I handed them the final page, a notarized notice of disinheritance. Mitchell stared at it, his mouth open, then looked at me as if seeing a stranger. Tammy's lips curled. "You think this is over?" she said. "You think you've won because you made a few calls and printed some letters?" I looked her dead in the eye. "No. I think I've won because I'm still standing. And because Barney is lying over there alive, because I didn't believe your lie." Mitchell grabbed her arm. "Let's go," he said. "We'll talk to a lawyer." I smiled faintly. "You'll find they've already heard from me?" They left without slamming the door. That would have required conviction. And they had none left. Only fear. Only the slow dawning realization that their future plans had collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. I sat there for a long time after they were gone, staring at the papers in my lap, Barney snoring beside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was something better. I was done. The morning the certified letter arrived, the sky was heavy with clouds, thick and unmoving, casting a dull grayness over the entire street. It seemed fitting, as though the world itself had paused, waiting for what would come next. The letter had the unmistakable weight and texture of legal paper. Too stiff to be casual, too official to be ignored. I opened it with hands that trembled less from fear than from a slow, measured anticipation. The kind a man develops when he's been preparing for battle, not of fists, but of signatures and intentions. Inside was exactly what I expected. A formal petition from Mitchell's attorney requesting an emergency hearing to determine my mental competency. According to the document, Mitchell and Tammy were gravely concerned for Gerald Monroe's ability to care for himself, manage his finances responsibly, and make sound decisions in his current state. Attached were fabricated accounts from family, friends, and a falsified doctor's note referencing early onset memory impairment. A note dated conveniently during the days I was sedated in the hospital. They hadn't even used the name of my actual physician. They had found some other willing signature, a friend of a friend, likely, someone licensed, but ethically flexible. For a moment, I simply stood in the kitchen, the letter resting open on the counter like an open wound. I looked down at Barney, who had limped into the room behind me and was now resting his chin on his paws, his cloudy eyes watching me with the patience only a dog can truly offer. "They're still coming," I said to him, my voice quieter than I intended. They didn't stop. But I had known they wouldn't. Mitchell had always been methodical, deliberate. The first attempt had failed. Barney had survived. I had come home. The lies had been exposed. But he had taken that as a setback, not a defeat. He wasn't just after my house or my money. This was about narrative. He wanted control of the story, wanted the world to believe that his father was a confused old man clinging to a world that no longer existed, and he, the dutiful son, was simply trying to prevent a tragedy. It wasn't theft, it was management, and in his mind, it made him noble. I called Charles Milton immediately, scanned and sent the documents to him before the coffee even finished brewing. He called me back 20 minutes later, voice clipped with professional fury. "This is deeply unethical," he said. "They're using weaponized concern, but we're ready." And we were. Within 48 hours, Charles had assembled 3 sworn statements from my physician, a neurologist, and a psychologist, all professionals with impeccable reputations, attesting to my full cognitive faculties and mental independence. He also gathered sworn statements from my banker, from Ruth, and from Marie at the sanctuary, each of whom recounted the events from their angle with calm clarity, dismantling every one of Mitchell's claims. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. It took place in a beige, windowless courtroom that smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. I wore my best suit, the same one I had worn to Ellie's funeral. Not because I wanted to make a show, but because I knew Mitchell would expect to see someone disheveled and weak. Instead, I stood tall, my posture straight despite the pain in my joints, my eyes clear, and my voice firm. Mitchell sat across the aisle wearing a tailored jacket and a look of concern so rehearsed it could have earned him a stage credit. Tammy was beside him, dressed modestly, her expression locked into sympathetic daughter-in-law mode. But her eyes betrayed her, cold, nervous, scanning the room for any sign that the story might be slipping out of her grasp. When the judge entered, we stood. When the judge spoke, we listened. And when it was my turn, I did not falter. I told the truth, not just facts, but the emotional truth of what had happened. I spoke of Ellie, of Barney, of the home I had built with my hands, of the betrayal that unfolded not in one grand gesture, but in small, accumulating lies. I handed over the file Charles and I had compiled, the forged forwarding form, the real estate inquiry, the intake forms, the bank access logs, the statements. I watched as the judge flipped through them slowly, eyes narrowing. And when Mitchell's lawyer stood to rebut, he faltered almost immediately. The judge asked questions that he could not answer. When asked why no formal diagnosis had been sought from my own doctor, the lawyer mumbled about logistical delays. When asked why Barney had been rehomed under false pretenses, he claimed miscommunication. The judge did not look convinced. Mitchell took the stand. He spoke about stress, about worry, about his fear that I was isolated and refusing help out of pride. He painted himself as a concerned son, trying to do the right thing. I watched him carefully. He had rehearsed every word, every pause, but the truth was a muscle he had not used in years, and it showed. The judge asked him directly why. If his concern had been genuine, he had not contacted my physician or allowed me to retain legal counsel before initiating actions that affected my assets. Mitchell stumbled. He said he thought he was allowed. The judge tilted her head. You thought you were allowed to act on behalf of a legally competent adult without permission? Mitchell said nothing. The decision came at the end of that day. The judge ruled that I was fully competent, and that the petition for guardianship was not only denied, but dismissed with prejudice. She warned Mitchell that any further attempts to circumvent my autonomy would result in legal sanctions. She recommended that I pursue charges of elder fraud and forgery should I wish to do so. And then she said something that I will carry with me until my last breath. She looked at me, not through me, but at me, and said, Mr. Monroe, I hope you understand that this is not common. Most people in your position don't have the clarity or the courage to defend themselves against their own blood. But you did, and I respect that. I nodded, unable to speak. Afterward, as the courtroom emptied, Mitchell stood near the exit, his jaw tight, his eyes red, not with remorse, but with humiliation. Tammy was already pulling on her coat, her face rigid. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. They knew. The illusion had shattered. The father they thought they could quietly erase had stood up, spoken out, and been believed. They had failed, not just legally, but publicly. Their story had been weighed and found wanting. And I had mine back. Barney was waiting for me when I returned home, his tail wagging weakly, his body rising with effort. I knelt beside him, ran my hand along the ridge of his spine, and whispered, We're all right now, boy. They can't touch us anymore. He looked at me, his eyes milky but trusting, and let out a long sigh before resting his head on my knee. The sun had broken through the clouds at last, and though the house was still quiet, it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a place that had been defended and reclaimed. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with gavel slams or headlines. Sometimes it's just the sound of your own heartbeat, steady and free, in a house that still belongs to you, with the dog who remembers everything. It's been 6 months since that day in court, and the house is quiet again, but this time not with dread or emptiness. The quiet now feels earned, like the calm after a storm that nearly tore the roof off, but ultimately passed, leaving the foundation intact. I still wake early, not because of any particular obligation, but because I've learned that silence in the morning can be a kind of victory. The old kettle takes its time to boil. The sunlight creeps slowly over the porch rail, and Barney lies curled on his blanket by the fireplace, breathing gently, his presence as grounding as ever. He doesn't move as quickly now, and some days his appetite fades. But he's still here. We both are. That's no small thing. Since the hearing, Mitchell hasn't called. Not once. No emails. No letters. No surprise visits. Part of me expected a second act, a new strategy, a sudden apology packaged in legal caution. But silence was all he gave me. And strangely, I was grateful for it. Tammy, too, disappeared from the edges of my life, as if her role had been retired, along with the story she tried to author. There was a time, not long ago, when I would have grieved that silence, interpreted it as finality, the last nail in the coffin of a father-son bond that should have outlived everything else. But I don't grieve it now. I understand it for what it is. A form of justice. Not revenge, not retribution, just a closing of accounts. They didn't get what they came for, and they knew better than to return. That, in the end, was enough. I had Charles help me close the joint bank accounts, revoke every access permission, and establish new financial protections that couldn't be tampered with. The will has been sealed and filed, with clear stipulations that no contest or challenge can undo the choices I made. I donated the bulk of my savings to the organizations Ellie and I once talked about supporting when we were younger, and foolish enough to think retirement would be a long, lazy chapter. I established a trust in Barney's name, not because he needs it, but because it felt right. A gesture. A recognition that he had, without knowing it, saved my life more than once. If anything is sacred in this world, it is the loyalty of a dog who never stops waiting for you to come home. Some afternoons, I walk the perimeter of the property, slower now, with a cane I once swore I'd never use. I trace the edges of what I nearly lost. The garden Ellie planted has grown wild in her absence, but I don't cut it back. I let it bloom as it wants to, as she would have. Birds come more frequently now. There's a woodpecker that returns each morning to the same corner of the roof, persistent as death, but less intrusive. I've begun feeding the strays who drift through the neighborhood, something I used to think would be a nuisance. But lately I find comfort in their transient trust. They come, they eat, they go. They owe nothing. And yet they return. I've thought a lot about forgiveness, whether it's owed, whether it's useful, whether it changes anything. I don't know if I've forgiven Mitchell. Some days I think I have. Other days I see the empty space on the mantel where his family photo used to sit, and the absence feels heavier than the frame ever did. I don't hate him. That would require energy I no longer have. But I don't miss him either. I miss the boy he was, the one who used to follow me around the garage, asking questions about nails and measurements, who cried when his first dog died, and asked me if souls went to heaven. That boy is gone. Maybe he left long before this happened. Maybe I'm mourning a ghost I invented. But the man he became, the one who lied, who schemed, who tried to bury me before I was cold, I don't mourn him. I simply turn the page. Ruth still visits. She brings banana bread and scolds me for not having a new phone. Sometimes we sit in silence, drinking tea, watching the trees shift color. Other times, she tells stories about her grandkids, about her late husband, about old neighbors who moved away and were never heard from again. Her presence reminds me that not everyone forgets, that not everyone discards the old when it becomes inconvenient, that some of us, even now, still believe in loyalty without conditions. Barney won't be with me much longer. I know that. His breathing is shallower now. His eyes are almost fully clouded. He doesn't bark anymore, but he still presses his head into my leg when I sit down. He still wags his tail weakly when I wake in the morning. And every night, before bed, I kneel beside him, rest my hand on his back, and whisper, "You did good, boy. You kept me human." I don't know what will come after he's gone. The house will be quieter, yes. The routines will collapse. The silence will return. But it won't be the silence of defeat. It will be the silence of having endured, of having stood when I could have fallen, of having spoken when I was meant to disappear. I am not the man I was before all this. I am older. I am slower, but I am no longer afraid. And when the end comes for me, and it will, as it comes for all men, I will meet it not with regret, but with the knowledge that I protected what mattered, that I didn't go quietly, that I didn't let my story be rewritten by those who forgot who I was, and that somewhere in the records of a small courtroom in Indiana, there is proof that Gerald Monroe lived, resisted, and in the end, remained.